On to the second story. This week saw clarity emerge on who are the presidential candidates on both sides of the political divide in the United States. Donald Trump got Republican nomination at party's national convention in Milwaukee, and President Joe Biden got dumped in favor of Kamala Harris for her to be the Democrat challenger to what seems like a Trump juggernaut post the July 13 assassination bid on him. What's in it for us in India? How would we get impacted if Trump is president? What would be the foreign policy consequences if Harris gets the mandate in November instead? Would Trump be a tariff hawk on India given his earlier position? Remember him calling us the tariff king. Or things have changed since 2020. Let's take a deep dive. Those watching foreign policy closely would recall that famous Trump soundbite. If you've forgotten, listen in.
India, which is the tariff king, they called us and they say, we want to start negotiations immediately.
Clearly, Trump did not forget. Trump ran his 2016 campaign posing as an outsider out to wreck the corrupt DC establishment. He turned that old Beltway metaphor, drain the swamp, into a campaign war cry. The phrase has been used by American politicians from Helen Jackson in 1880s to Ronald Reagan in 1980s, a century later, and became Trump's talisman, with the former president using it as many as 150 times in his social media posts in the 2016-2020 period. In some ways, he was an outsider even for the Republican establishment, and that outsider's worldview affected both domestic and foreign policy. Steps like meeting Kim Jong-un of North Korea, going soft on Putin, shifting US embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and of course, the biggest one, threatening to disband NATO if Europe did not pay up, were all maverick policy shifts that had the mark of his outsiderness. Trump carried the same unconventional approach to his position on China. It was for the first time, perhaps, that the threat from China was acknowledged publicly at that level of DC establishment. Trump not only went public, but translated that into policy consequences, changing 2 decades-old American stance of facilitating and accommodating China's economic rise to one of countering and containing the dragon.
Over the last 2 decades, but those days are over. We will no longer tolerate such abuse. We will not allow our workers to be victimized.
Trump's India relations must be seen in the context of that China shift. He revived the defunct Quad grouping in 2018. In geostrategic sense, this was a substantial upgrade on optics for India's positioning in the Committee of Nations. It was under Trump that the Pacific Command of the US Defense Forces was renamed as Indo-Pacific Command, emphasizing the pivot to India. Resuscitating Quad and making Indo-Pacific a catchphrase gave such FOMO to European powers that from the United Kingdom to Germany, from France to Italy, everyone came out with their own Indo-Pacific strategy papers. With India as a pivot for this strategic space, New Delhi saw a visible upgrade in travel itineraries, becoming a more frequent pit stop for global diplomacy. Trump's NATO skepticism and judgment-neutral views on Putin also mean that India would get a larger breathing space to nurture its Russia partnership without bothering about an ideological hectoring, which has sort of peaked after PM Modi's Moscow visit last month. We have seen Biden administration making it a prestige issue, with innumerable briefings where unhappiness has been conveyed. There was a minor tiff with the US Ambassador Eric Garcetti in New Delhi when he responded to MEA's espousal of a strategic autonomy on Modi-Putin hug by suggesting that there's no strategic autonomy in a war. Clearly, believing that Europe's war is everybody's war and that India is already considered a party was Garcetti's ideological position. Sometimes those pinpricks have turned farcical. Like on Thursday, when a Pakistani reporter sought US State Department views on the Yogi government's Kanwar Yatra diktat in Uttar Pradesh, and the visibly clueless spokesperson obliged with an answer, albeit with restraints.
We have seen those reports. We have also seen the reports that the Indian Supreme Court on July 22nd issued an interim stay on the implementation of those rules, so they're not actually in effect now, with our Indian counterparts on the importance of equal treatment for members of all religious communities.
These kinds of hectoring, lecturing, pontificating, holier-than-thou approaches to conducting diplomacy with India would obviously taper off under Trump.
They'll charge you like 250% tariff. We don't want it. Then you get an invite. Build your plant over here. So these companies, they go over there. Harley-Davidson did it in India. They couldn't sell. They had a 200% tariff on motorbikes. I had them in the office in the White House.
But as that Michigan speech showed, Trump has not forgotten India's tariff walls. If elected, he might come hard on them in his second term. But it would not be different from earlier, when he came double hard on China and rest of the world. So on trade, it would be a closely watched space. Even here, a lot has changed since Trump passed on the baton, however reluctantly, to Biden in 2021. We are in a post-COVID world with strong linkages, but stronger disruptions. Two current wars in Europe and the Middle East, and half a dozen flashpoints from Armenia, Azerbaijan to China, India, and China, Philippines, and China, Taiwan, mean that scope for an all-out trade war is limited for America also. A reluctant trading partner, India, is much better than a thieving China, is the Trump worldview. Connected with trade is the issue of visas, the H-1B holy grail for India's IT industry. The disruptions on that front have become secular between Republicans and Democrats. What Trump might deny loudly was done by Biden surreptitiously, blaming the slow bureaucracy for the application pileup. If Trump comes down heavy on illegal migration from the southern borders of the United States, why should it be a diplomacy concern for us? Kamala, on the other hand, never built the wall, never been to the wall. If anything, her visa denials might put her open to the charge of double standards, given the liberal Democrats' position on open borders and accommodating illegals as deep as New York and Chicago. With increasing economic power, China is also a military threat, which of course India is not. In a way, India's evolving relationship with the United States has a bipartisan consensus on both the Capitol Hill and the Raisina Hill. From Clinton to Biden, DC has seen India's rise as being in America's interest. Trump only continued the uptick in US-India relations, minus the preachiness of some Democrat presidencies. The only catch: while Trump might come hard on China on issues of trade and technology, his insularity might make the United States less inclined to intervene on Taiwan in case of a Chinese military maneuver. And that might make India dig in deeper trenches in Arunachal Pradesh and Ladakh. But we cross the bridge when it comes. Republicans and Democrats have divergent views on climate change, from Bush Jr. versus Al Gore in early 2000s to Trump versus John Kerry now. Not that Kerry, Biden's special emissary on climate change, has been very effective in the absence of climate finance. But a Kamala presidency would continue to push a global effort to respect carbon-neutral deadlines at the very least. In case of a Trump return, expect climate change to petter off the missionary mode mechanisms of the US, not just for India, but for the rest of the world as well. Whatever we are doing on green energy transition would have to have an internal mojo, minus the American push. There's an innate commitment in Prime Minister Modi to drive policy and governance to tackle climate change. A Biden-Harris push is good in the sense that it helps connect that internalized commitment with financial support. We would do fine even without. If you believe the social media echo chamber, Kamala Harris is more left than liberal. Many of her videos from the past project a picture of her as representing a kind of wokeism which makes even liberal pro-Democrat party commentators like Bill Maher cringe. A Harris presidency might make those irritable American interventions on human rights, climate, social harmony, secularism, pluralism, minority rights, gay rights, LGBTQIA rights little more pronounced.
I am Kamala Harris. My pronouns are she and her. I am a woman sitting at the table wearing a blue suit.
But let me share an anecdote from Prime Minister Modi's first Biden-Harris meeting in the autumn of 2021 in Washington, D.C. I was covering from the ground. The general impression that the Indian entourage carried to the White House was that Biden would be easy. Kamala, with her hard left swing, would be more difficult. By the time the two meetings ended, the view changed completely. According to those accompanying the Prime Minister, it was Biden who went off tangent a couple of times, while the conversation with Kamala ended up being the one without creases. If politics makes strange bedfellows, diplomacy throws stranger surprises. So we can only second guess who between Trump and Kamala would be better for India. Ultimately, an American president has to be good to America. Being good to India can only be a corollary to that overarching thought. We have to carve out our own trajectory, taking into account both the possibilities. Democrat President Clinton was an NPT Ayatollah. He tried unsuccessfully to arm twist P.V. Narasimha Rao to sign on the dotted line so that we could never become a nuclear power. Post the Shakti tests by the Vajpayee government, once the bluff and bluster of sanctions had petered out, same Clinton started India's dehyphenation with Pakistan in American foreign policy. His Republican successor, George W. Bush Jr., made the civil nuclear deal possible. Imagine, the United States amended a domestic law of 1954 to make the 123 agreement possible to end India's nuclear apartheid. Obama years saw India firmly in American arc with major strides in trade and defense cooperation. It was Obama who called the India-US relationship one of the defining partnerships of the 21st century. Obama also became the first US president to openly endorse India's bid for permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Trump and Biden maintain the bipartisan consensus, and irrespective of who wins in November, the United States-India relationship remains evenly poised. Thanks for watching.